So, I've got something super interesting for you today on Unsolved and Unfinished. And, honestly, it's pretty dark stuff we're going to be getting into.
Oh man, you have no idea. Like, this is one of the most, and I mean absolutely one of the most notorious cases in American criminal history.
Yeah. We're talking about John Wayne Gacy today. And I've got to say, I'm really curious about this whole story because, there's so much to unpack here.
Right. And you know what's really fascinating about this case? We're talking about someone who was literally living this double life in the 1970s. You know, he was this respected businessman and actually a pretty well-known figure in his community. But behind all that, well, that's where things get really, really dark.
I've heard he was called the Killer Clown or something. That's pretty disturbing.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely right. See, he would actually perform as this character, Pogo the Clown, at children's parties and charity events. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, you know what I mean? Because underneath this whole community-minded facade, there was just this absolutely horrifying reality.
So I'm really curious about how someone like this, how does someone end up going down such a dark path? What was his childhood like?
Oh man, this is where it all starts to make sense. Well, not make sense exactly, but you know what I mean. So Gacy grew up in Chicago, right? And his father was just absolutely terrible to him. We're talking about this guy who was like an alcoholic World War I vet who would literally beat John and his sisters with a razor strap if they did anything he thought was wrong.
Wait, seriously? With a razor strap?
Yeah, and that's not even the worst of it. His dad would just constantly belittle him, always calling him stupid, always comparing him to his sisters, just really crushing his spirit from such a young age.
That's pretty messed up.
And here's the thing, right? Gacy was also dealing with all these health issues. He was this overweight kid who couldn't really do sports, and he had this heart condition that kept him from playing with other kids. And his dad, instead of being understanding, would just accuse him of faking it all for attention.
Were there any other traumatic experiences in his childhood?
Unfortunately, yes. Between the ages of 6 and 10, there was this really inappropriate situation with a family friend's daughter, and then he was actually molested by another family friend who was a contractor. And you know what's really significant about all this? This is when he started realizing he was attracted to men, which caused him just tremendous internal conflict.
What about his education and early career? How did he sort of move forward from all that?
Well, that's interesting because even though he didn't graduate high school, he actually managed to get through Northwestern Business College in Chicago. And he was pretty good at sales, he worked at this shoe company and actually did really well. Then in '64, he meets this woman named Marlyn Myers, and that's when things started to look up for him. At least on the surface.
So, from what you're saying, he actually managed to build, a normal life for himself at some point?
Oh yeah, that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. See, Gacy actually became this really successful contractor, right? He started his own business called PDM Contractors, and it just took off. And get this, he even became this Democratic precinct captain in the Chicago suburbs in the 70s.
Wait, so he was actually involved in politics?
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting about that? He later said that maybe he got into politics just to kind of stick it to his dad, who used to mock his interest in that stuff. And he was actually really well liked in the community, organizing these cultural events and being super active in this civic group called the JCs.
What about this whole clown thing I keep hearing about?
Right, so that's another fascinating part of all this. He was part of this Chicago area Jolly Joker clown club, and he would actually perform at children's parties and charity events as these characters he created. Pogo the Clown, or Patches the Clown. And here's something really chilling. He actually told detectives once that clowns can get away with murder.
That's pretty creepy, considering what we know now.
Exactly, and what's really significant here is that during this time, he was married twice, right? First to Marlene Myers in '64, and then later to Carol Hoff in '72. Like, he was really trying to maintain this image of being this upstanding citizen, you know? Hosting these summer parties that everyone in the neighborhood would come to, being this successful businessman. It was all about creating this perfect facade.
When did things start to, take a darker turn?
So like the first known murder happened in January 1972, and it's just absolutely chilling. He lured this 16-year-old kid, Timothy McCoy, to his house, right? And then what happened next is just, well, Gacy actually said this was when he discovered that death was like the ultimate thrill for him.
How? How did he usually get his victims?
Well, see, that's where his business really came into play. Most of his victims were actually these young employees from his contracting company, or people he'd promised jobs to. He'd get them to his house and he developed this whole method, you know? He'd often use these handcuffs, telling his victims it was part of some magic trick.
That's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, and it gets worse, because like, by the mid-70s, he was really escalating. He called this his cruising years, and that's when most of the murders happened. And get this, he actually had some of his young employees dig trenches in his crawl space, telling them it was for construction work. But really, he was having them dig graves.
Wait, so the victims were actually digging?
Yeah, exactly. Like this one victim, Gregory Godzik, who was just 17. He actually told his family about digging trenches for Gacy before he disappeared. And when the family contacted Gacy about their missing son, he just told them Gregory had probably run away from home. The crawl space eventually got so full that he started dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River instead.
Did no one ever suspect anything?
That's the thing. Some people did. Like, there were actually multiple accusations of rape, and some families were constantly calling the police about their missing kids. But Gacy he was so good at explaining things away, and his reputation in the community was so strong that, well, people just kept believing him.
So what finally led to him getting caught? I mean, after all those years?
Right, so like, it all came down to this 15-year-old kid named Robert Peast. Right? And what's really interesting is that this was actually in December 1978. See, PS told his mom he was going to meet with Gacy about, like, a potential construction job and, well, he never came back.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and this time things were different because, Peast's family immediately filed a missing person report, and the police, they actually started taking it seriously. They got a warrant to search Gacy's house in Norwood Park, and what they found was just absolutely suspicious.
What kind of things did they find?
So they found all these really concerning items, like police badges, a pistol, these hypodermic needles, and get this, they even found items that belonged to some of his previous victims. But the real smoking gun was, well, they found this receipt in Gacy's house that belonged to Peast.
And that's what led them to the bodies?
Exactly, because see, Gacy had told the police he'd never even met Piest that day. But this receipt, it completely contradicted his story. And once they had that, they did more thorough searches and that's when they found those trenches in the crawl space, just filled with human remains. It was absolutely horrifying. Gacy eventually broke down and confessed to killing about 30 people.
That must have been just devastating for all those families.
Yeah, and you know what's really tragic? The house had to be literally torn apart to find all the evidence. Like they had to completely dismantle it. One of the workers who helped demolish it later said, and I'll never forget this quote. He said, "If the devil's alive, he lived here."
So, what happened during the trial? I mean, with all that evidence.
Oh man, so like, the trial started in February 1980, and here's the thing that's really wild about it. See, Gacy had already confessed to the crimes, right? But his whole defense strategy was trying to convince everyone he was insane.
How did he try to prove that?
So get this, he spent like hundreds of hours with doctors at this correctional center in Illinois, and he came up with this really bizarre story about having multiple personalities. He claimed he had this split personality thing going on where he was like, the contractor, the clown, the politician, and then there was this other personality he called Bad Jack, who supposedly hated gay people and saw his victims as like complete scum.
Did anyone actually believe that?
Well, that's the thing. The prosecution totally destroyed that argument. They were like, look at how methodically he planned everything, right? And how carefully he tried to cover it all up. The jury, they didn't buy it for a second. After just a really short deliberation, they found him guilty of all 33 murders.
What happened after that?
So he spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center, and get this, he actually set up this like 900 number where people could call and hear him claiming he was innocent. But in the end, he was executed by lethal injection in 1994. And you know what's really interesting? Even today, they're still identifying victims using DNA. Like in 2021, they finally identified this victim named Francis Wayne Alexander, who disappeared back in '76.
It's just absolutely chilling to think about the impact this case had, not just on Chicago, but on the whole country, really.
Yeah, and like, the thing that really gets me is that we're still uncovering new details even today, right? Like the fact that they're still identifying victims after all these years just shows the massive scale of Gacy's crimes.
What about the families still waiting for answers?
That's exactly it. And you know what's really heartbreaking about this whole thing? Some families have been waiting, like literally decades, just to find out what happened to their loved ones. And every time they identify another victim through DNA, it's like, it brings closure to one family, but also reminds us that there might be others still out there.
It really makes you think about the long-lasting effects of these crimes.
Absolutely, and you know what's really significant about this case? It completely changed how law enforcement handles missing persons cases, especially involving young men. Because, you see, back then they'd often just assume these guys had run away, right? But now they take these disappearances so much more seriously.
Looking back at this whole case, it's just staggering. The sheer scale of it, the deception, the fact that so many young lives were lost. It really is one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history.
Yeah, and what really sticks with me is how it took years for the full truth to come out. Even now, families are still getting closure decades later, and that just shows how deep the scars of this case run.
And it also changed so much about how missing persons cases are handled today. If there's anything we can take away from this, it's that we have to listen. We have to take people seriously when they go missing, because assuming someone just ran away can mean the difference between solving a case or letting a monster continue.
Exactly. And with advancements in DNA technology, there's still hope that every last victim will eventually be identified. For the families who have been waiting, I hope they get the answers they deserve.
Yeah, and on that note, that's where we're going to leave it for today. But if you want to keep up with more cases like this, ones that are still being solved even after all these years, make sure you're subscribed and following us for more episodes.
And if you have thoughts on this case, let us know in the comments or on social media. There's always more to uncover, and we love hearing your theories and perspectives.
Thanks for listening to Unsolved and Unfinished. Stay curious, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone.